My name is Jim Turk. I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression, and I'd like to welcome all of you to tonight's event. We want to begin with a land acknowledgement. As you know, Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Our event tonight brings together some very interesting people. And before I introduce them, I want to thank Peggy Shannon, the chair of the School of Performance, who's co-sponsoring this tonight, and also Robin Sokolowski, who's the executive director of the Playwrights Guild of Canada, who collaborated with me and with Keith in choosing the panel and setting it up, and I'm grateful to both of you. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge Ange Holmes. Ange is the coordinator for the Center for Free Expression and is the one who does all the work to make the evening happen. The Center puts on 6 to 8 panels and events a year, in addition to having a film series on films having to do with repression, dissent, and freedom of expression. Our panels deal with a whole range of issues regarding freedom of expression and the public's right to know. So I'd like to introduce our panel tonight and ask them to come up as I introduce them. The first panelist, I'm doing this in alphabetical order except for the moderator, who I'll do last, is Philip Aiken. Philip is the artistic director for the Obsidian Theatre Company, a theatre company dedicated to the exploration, development, and production of the Black voice. He has served as the artistic director since 2006. I hope my facts are right here, Philip.
Close enough.
And he was a founding member of Obsidian in 1999. In the past 10 years, Philip has directed more than a dozen plays at Obsidian, as well as plays at the Shaw Festival, the Blythe Festival, the Ryerson Theatre School, Neptune Theatre, the Factory Theatre, and the Fountain School of Performing Arts, and the Harold Green Jewish Theatre. Philip has won many awards for his directing. He's had 5 Dora nominations for Best Director in the General Theatre Division, winning both in 2012 and in 2017. He received the My Entertainment Award Best Director for Venus' Daughter in 2016, and he won the Toronto Theatre Critics Award for Best Director in 2017. But that's not the end of his awards. He won the William Kilbourne Award for the celebration of Toronto's cultural life in 2014, life membership in the Canadian Actors Equity Association for outstanding contribution to the performing arts, and the Playwrights Guild of Canada Women's Caucus Bras d'Or Award for supporting and promoting the work of Canadian women playwrights, and the Mallory Gilbert Leadership Award. Let me see if the list goes on.
No.
Yes, there's one more. And the Toronto Alliance for Performing Arts Silver Ticket Award for outstanding contribution to the arts. So join me in welcoming Philip Aiken. Our second panelist is Pat Bradley. Pat is the theatre major organizations and compass officer at the Ontario Arts Council and a course director in the Arts and Media MBA program of the Schulich School of Business at York University. Pat is a founding member of Canadian Arts Data and a founder of Arts Vote Toronto in the 1990s. She has a BA from Concordia University and an MBA from the Schulich School of Business at York. As well as teaching at Schulich, Pat annually teaches at the National Theatre School and has taught or been a guest lecturer at the University of Toronto, Brock University, George Brown College, University of Windsor, and Humber College. She also offers workshops and classes on arts management, cultural policy, and applying for grants. You might have a long line of people wanting that last one.
Always.
She has previously worked for a number of national arts service organizations, served as president of both the Canadian Conference of the Arts and of 12 Alexander Street. She is a member of the Ontario Nonprofit Network's Policy Steering Committee and a member of the Not-for-Profit Advisory Committee of the Canadian Accounting Standards Board. So a woman of considerable background and achievement. So join me in welcoming Pat. Stephen is Mohawk of the Six Nations with Jewish heritage. He is currently the director of Creating, Knowing, and Sharing the Arts and Cultures of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Peoples program at the Canada Council for the Arts. A curator, scholar, writer, and media artist, he was named in 2010 a Trudeau National Visiting Fellow here at Ryerson. Stephen has also held positions such as the curator in residence of the Indigenous art at the National Gallery of Canada, director and curator of Urban Shaman Gallery in Winnipeg, Aboriginal curator of the Art Gallery of Hamilton, producer and artistic director of the Native Indian Inuit Photographers Association. Stephen has curated a group and solo exhibitions across Canada and internationally, written extensively for magazines, catalogs, and arts publications, and lectured widely in Canada and internationally. He has co-edited 2 books, Transference Technology Tradition, Aboriginal Media and the New Media Art, published by the Banff Centre, and Coded Territories, Indigenous Pathways and New Media, published by the University of Calgary Press in 2014. So please join me in welcoming Stephen. You're getting the picture. This is a high-powered panel. Our final panelist is Adrienne Wong. She is an Ottawa-based artist whose work straddles theatrical and digital space. Her web projects include The Apology Generator, which earned her the inaugural Artist in Residence position at CBC's Radio Q. Second one is sadsongs.ca, commissioned by Night Swimming Theatre in Toronto. Landline, created with Dustin Harvey, is a performance for audio recording and SMS and continues to tour nationally and internationally. Me on the Map, created with Jan Derbyshire, is a kids show about urban planning and collective decision-making. It received a Jessie Award nomination in Vancouver and was selected for the Banff Centre for the Arts and Creativity 2017 Playwrights Colony. Adrienne's writing has been published in CTR, Canadian Times, and the anthology Asian Canadian Theatre. A graduate of Simon Fraser University, Adrienne was artistic producer at New World Theatre in Vancouver until 2013, is currently digital architect at Spiderweb Show Performance in Ottawa, I believe.
Well,
all over, well, actually, yes.
yeah, on the internet.
Please join me in welcoming Adrienne. And finally, and not least, the man who has responsibility for keeping these folks in check. I was looking for the right word. I didn't know quite what the right word was.
Jail?
Oh, good.
And if things drag, spurring them on to engage with each other and with you. This is Keith Barker. He's our moderator tonight. He's the artistic director of Native Earth Performing Arts, Canada's oldest professional Indigenous theatre company. It's now in its 35th season. Native Earth is a leader in producing and presenting and showcasing Indigenous artists and their creations. Keith began his association with the company as an actor in 2007, was artistic associate from 2008 to 2010, and has been artistic director since May of 2017. He is a recipient of an SAT Award for Excellence in Playwriting and the Yukon Arts Audience Award for Best Art for Social Change for his play, The Hours That Remain.
Ani, Bojo, Kwekwe. My name is Keith Barker. I'm Algonquin Métis from the Mattawa and Golden Lake Reserve area. But I was born and raised in Kenora, Geraldton, Long Lac, Thunder Bay, Ontario. So welcome. I just wanted to start by saying I would talk about how the evening's going to unfold here. So each of the panelists, we're going to give them each a couple minutes to comment on the evening's topic. And then we will begin with a few questions and we'll start a discussion with all of us. And then that'll take about an hour or so. And then we'll bring the audience into it. And so then we can start taking questions from the audience and we can further the conversation together. But first, let's start with this evening's topic. Are arts funders starting to define the arts? In the last few years, there's been a major shift with funders. One of the more recent events is the creation of the new funding model at the Canada Council for the Arts, who streamlined its many programs into 6 funding streams: the Indigenous section, Touring National, Touring International, supporting arts organizations, artist-driven organizations, and then larger companies, institutions, and companies that serve particular communities. There's also been a renewed investment by government at all levels, federal, provincial, municipal, for example. The Canada Council will see its funding doubled by 2021. The Ontario Arts Council and the Toronto Arts Council have both seen increases in their budgets since 2013. This new investment addresses systematic inequities. The Toronto Arts Council's increase was to quote, to address funding inequities amongst currently funded organizations, but also providing new support for culturally diverse organizations. The Ontario Arts Council has identified their 6 priority groups in their new funding. That's Indigenous, Francophone, artists of color, new generation artists, deaf artists, and artists with disabilities, and artists from regions outside of Toronto. At the Canada Council, the new funding model means new guidelines. The Council has addressed equity that had previously been implied but not required. For example, in the new wording for Engage and Sustain, they ask organizations what their commitment is through programming, organizational makeup, and the diversity of your geographical community or region, particularly with regards to the inclusion and engagement of Aboriginal peoples, culturally diverse groups, people who are deaf or have disabilities, and official language minority communities. Now, with these expectations from the government, they play a major part in how grants are delivered. People advocate to the government for new money, and these requirements come out of the case made for arts funding. This change can be difficult. It often comes with contention, disagreement, and a question of priorities. So let me begin by asking each of our panelists here to speak briefly about the question posed this evening. Are arts funders starting to define art?
So thank you very much for having me here this evening. I'm going to share my observations as a practicing artist. And as I was considering this question, there's 2 things that I was thinking about. The first is my observation, I guess in the last 18 years as I've been working, of an increase in what I call relevant art. And relevant, I mean projects that have a political or social agenda, that deal with cultural, political, social, or economic inequity, and that perhaps are socially or community engaged projects. So projects that pair artists with communities to focus on a project of mutual concern. So in this type of project, the process is usually the focus rather than the outcome. So for example, you wouldn't get funded to do your 100-person version of The King and I using unpaid community artists. That wouldn't get the grant. So these are all examples of work that may or may not exist without economic incentive or subsidy. And the optimist in me wants to think that some of them are the best examples of how art can impact individuals and communities in a positive way by raising awareness, by sparking dialogue or policy change, and by increasing a sense of togetherness or confidence within a community. But the cynic in me also sees this type of work and the funding programs that encourage it as examples of the instrumentalization of art, using art as a tool to achieve something else other than being art. So it's subtle. No one is saying your play must be relevant to be successful in a grant competition, but in a dead heat between funding a production of an Alan Ayckbourn play, for example, versus a collective creation about Canadian families struggling with homelessness, all other things being equal, I would probably put my horse or my money behind the new Canadian creation. First, because it's new. Second, because it's Canadian. And third, because it seems more important to what's happening right now than the Alan Ayckbourn play. I guess it depends on which play. I think the new collective creation could have more impact and make more of a difference. This is all hypothetical. But you see, it's a thing, this desire to be useful. I've internalized it as an artist, and it's hard for me to imagine an alternative. So if I'm going to be spending that taxpayer money on this stuff that I make, it sure better be useful. The taxpayer's footing the bill and should be getting something from us. And that something is above and beyond the intrinsic value of art. That something has to be labeled as social good or economic driver or deeply relevant or social change. And so art becomes a tool for change, for social good, for economic development, to attract tourists, to build our communities. It is so very useful. Which is great, right? Because we all want to be useful. But what is missing from these discussions is acknowledgement of that intrinsic value of art. The acknowledgement that what we do as artists to attempt to express the inexpressible, to grapple with human dilemma, to capture beauty through gesture, through a glance, to feel heartbreak every night, and navigate through grief every night and loss, to do those actions in service of you, the beloved audience. Those actions themselves have value, and that they simply are is profoundly important. Now, of course, measuring intrinsic values and doling out grant funding based on a competition of inherent value is so impossible that the process itself could be an art project. So other criteria must come into the decision-making process, which brings me to the second thing I was thinking about as I considered this question. I just keep looking at you for
I love it.
moral
Keep
support.
going, please. I need that.
Yeah, opening up to the
Yes.
that side of the house too. Okay, so yes, that was cultural diversity initiatives. Yes, yeah, let's start joking about those. All right, so cultural diversity initiatives were strategic priorities that were communicated by multiple funding bodies in the late 90s, early aughts. And I'm thinking specifically of Vancouver, where I was living at the time. So the funders that I was dealing with at that time were the Canada Council, the BC Arts Council, and the City of Vancouver, each of which had their version of the Cultural Diversity Initiative. So these programs had a direct influence on who was making the art, and therefore have played a part in defining what the art was going to be in the end. And some of these programs, like the Canada Council's Stand Firm equity grants, benefited companies driven by diversity-based mandates and could be considered affirmative action because they addressed historic inequities and discrimination. And this program, the equity program, was something that I benefited from, and my career as a maker and an artist was defined by those early opportunities which were afforded to me through those programs. So is this a good thing? For me, yeah. For the average white guy, maybe not. But statistics would say that the average white guy doesn't really need much help to get ahead. Not as much as the half Asian cis female, but I digress. All this to say that I think the funders already define the art. The funders demand that we rationalize our choices in relationship to progressive identity and cultural politics by writing it into the criteria and guidelines. The people who make the decisions, our peers on the assessment panels, invest in those criteria, and they apply them at the table that the money is, and they hand out the money accordingly. Moreover, the funders define the art by creating the categories that Keith just described into which your art fall, about how the art is funding, by spreading resources thin, by rewarding long lists of things achieved this season, by being part of a system where artists consistently undervalue their greatest asset, themselves. This is a systemic problem. So perhaps, in closing, Keith,
Yes.
if we all had a guaranteed living wage, maybe we would see a different kind of art. Because it's important to remember that there is art happening that's not publicly funded. There is art that is really good, art that speaks to people, art that is fueled by passion and drive, by obsession and a need to solve a problem and work a thought out to the end. Thank you.
Yes, our arts funders beginning to define the art. So when people got in touch with me because they heard I was on this panel, the first thing they said was, starting? So I'm afraid I'm going to agree with a lot of what Adrian said because, yeah, I think that I don't know about the word define, but whatever it is we're talking about, it's not a new phenomenon. So I would kind of quarrel with the use of the word define, and also in the longer description of what this is. Critics have charged that arts funders in Canada have begun imposing bureaucratic rules that compromise artistic freedom. I agree with a lot of the words in that, but not compromise artistic freedom. But before I quarrel, I'm going to go into a little bit about how funders actually work, which may be incredibly boring to those of you that are intimately familiar with this and have written thousands of grant applications in your life, but bear with me. And the other thing I want to do, which is a completely losing battle, just so you know, is to destigmatize the word bureaucracy. that was in that thing. The bureaucratic rules. There are reasons bureaucracies exist. There's lots of reasons bureaucracies exist, and some of them are not good, but some of them are very good. Some of the reasons that bureaucracies exist. And a good bureaucracy does a couple of things, and one of them is no surprises. There's nobody who applies to an arts funder who should be surprised at anything along the way, at what it is they're being asked to do, at what the criteria and the guidelines, and who's going to assess it, how it's going to assess, how long it's going to take, when you're going to hear about it, et cetera, et cetera. All of that should be crystal clear, and occasionally there's little bumps in the road and all those things, but that is the intention of all those bureaucracies that make arts funding decisions. This includes stating and serving priorities, either in individual programs or across arts councils. And we've already heard now twice about how those priorities are stated by funders. I'm going to talk about OACs for a second, but I want to give an example from way back. So for the 60 plus years that the Canada Council has existed, and the 50 plus years that the Ontario Arts Council has existed, and the 40 plus years that the TAC has existed, and arts funders across the country in different places, in my field, theatre, one of the things that we've always seen since day one was the prioritization of Canadian playwrights. That has allowed us to create a huge canon of excellent work by Canadian playwrights, which wouldn't have existed unless the funders said, actually, all things being equal, over that Alan Ayckbourn play, we'll take a play by Keith Barker or any other playwright. So yes, for 60 years, the arts councils have been setting priorities that have changed, I believe, changed the face of theatre in this country. Does that compromise artistic freedom? I don't think so. Not artistic freedom, no. At the risk of, now I'm going to go into a little bit about the process of how we do that, just to be really clear. And I'm going to use the Ontario Arts Council, which I know best, as my example because I do that every day, so I'm quite familiar with it. We're an arm's length arts council, so that means that government gives us almost 100% of our money. Every year they write us a check. Sometimes the check is more, as it has been in the last couple of years. And government doesn't interfere in granting decisions. It doesn't say, take this money and make sure that Native Earth gets a grant and that Obsidian gets a grant, but that the Toronto Symphony doesn't get a grant, or vice versa. That's not the level of discussion we have, and I'm not part of that discussion, but with the provincial government, but we have common interests. And very frequently, Keith talked about making the case. We're always making the case. You're always making the case for more funding for those of you that are particularly in service organizations. I'm grinning at Robin back there. Making the case for more funding. And we have to somehow align ourselves with what government's priorities are. And that could be making sure that citizens all across Ontario, not just in the big city of Toronto, have access. That could be a focus on employment, on good jobs and paying people properly. I don't know how well we do that. That could be community engagement. That might be a huge priority for us and the province. Expressions of Ontario's culture that get out and about around the world and around the country. So all of those things are things we have in common. And then we take that overall approach, very large, writ large, and we have a business plan and a strategic plan, and then individual program priorities. And it's very, very it's very hierarchical, and it's very, very rational in a certain kind of way, and it's not unpredictable, and it's not serendipitous. So to repeat what Keith said, for the last couple of years, and I'm going to talk about one particular example, the artists that we prioritize for funding are Indigenous artists, artists of color, Francophone artists, new generation artists, artists outside the city of Toronto, and deaf artists and artists with disabilities. And I've been there for 17 years, and it hasn't been quite as large a list, and it's been added to. Most recently, in our 2014-2020 strategic plan that we're operating under now, we added deaf artists and artists with disabilities. This had been certainly something that all of the officers and programs paid attention to, but it wasn't written down. And as of this strategic plan, it was written down as one of our priorities. We're very explicit about making sure that jurors represented, applications coming from all of these various areas, including artists with disabilities and deaf artists, and we introduced a program that specifically funds that activity. So a couple of years on, what do we see? We see that the applications and the grants have risen hugely. Now, we're not talking in the absolute in absolute terms like millions and millions of dollars or applications. But we are talking way, way more applications from artists with disabilities and deaf artists than we used to get. Why is that? Because we named it and we said it, and every time one of us goes out to do a granting session, of which I do millions, we talk about it and we make sure that the consciousness is there. It has made a big difference in our practice, and it's made a big difference in what we fund in that way. So, all of those priority groups are meant to be served by all of our programs. And I think one of the underlying thoughts about changes and different priorities that people are worried about is that, and something that you hear a lot is that, well, really we should only just worry about excellence of the art, excellence of the artist. And first of all, I'm going to state the really stupidly obvious. Those are not mutually exclusive in any way, shape, or form, being an artist of color, an Indigenous artist, or a new generation artist, or anything else, or an artist from outside the big city of Toronto. But secondly, it's another lens of discussion when funders make decisions. So my metaphor is always, because I have really bad eyes, so I go to the eye doctor and they put one set of lenses down in front of me and I go, oh yeah, I do see much better. And that's the criteria of whatever the program is. And then the second lens, and that's when I really see well and I say, oh yes, now I can see distance and close up. Those are our strategic priorities and the other things that we need to take care of and think about. Every applicant knows exactly what our priorities are. Every jury we manage knows exactly what those priorities are and what they're charged to do. And there are various parts of it. So there's our strategic plan. There are what's going on in the field. There are overarching umbrella documents like the Ontario Human Rights Code, like the French Language Services Act, which is why Francophone artists are a priority, and the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. All of those go into our decision-making process and most of the other funders. When we do change these things, add or subtract priorities, we do them in response generally to what's going on in the field. We tend to be fairly responsive rather than, not always, but in a lot of cases we're responsive. We're hearing that there's a lot of disability arts practice that we don't have a particular place for or a particular way of looking at. So that's how we change things. And that, in the case, as I say, the sort of case study of the disability arts practice has made quite a change in the number of applications we get. I don't know why I wrote it down because I'm saying it in a completely different order. So I've talked about our process. I've talked about how we get to it. None of these measures, the strategic plan, the UN, taking into account the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, thinking about who is charged with telling whose story, none of these censor any artist. I'm going to take a sidestep and come back to that. In some programs, and we're not an unusual funder, we fund as few as 10% of the applications we receive. So I was on our website today and noticed that in 2016-17, we received 11,678 applications for grants from artists and arts organizations, and we funded 3,494 of them. We didn't stop the art happening in the other, what's my arithmetic, 8,000 or so. Some people may have gone, I can't do this right now because I need to pay the other artists, but other people would have just gone on and made their art and not been stopped. So we never have enough to fund everything that's fundable. Lots of artists go forward without public funding, sometimes, always. It depends on the artist. So I don't think censorship is an issue. Artistic freedom is not being threatened by funders. Funded art is being selectively chosen by arts funders through, in the case of arts councils, a peer assessment process, and that's our job and that's what we do.
Obviously, I think I agree that the councils and funding bodies have always leaned in or strategically had priorities by which they've changed the entire ecosystem. And I think historically we have to go back and take a look at when the Canada Council decided that it would be a great thing if there were regional theatres throughout the country. And millions of dollars were put into the fact that we now have regional theaters across the country. And they were staffed primarily by ex-Brits who did ex-Brit shows and American shows. And that went on for a while. And people came out from Toronto and did the work. And then there was a huge push to get Canadian stories. So that was great, right? We had a lot of Canadian stories. We've got 1837, we've got the farm show, we've got lots of farmers and wheat guys and fishermen and shit. But for every winner, there are losers. And that's what never gets addressed for me. So, Canadian stories, all the money that went to build Factory, Passe Muraille, all those guys. There were also 2 black theater companies here in the town. One was called Theatre Fountainhead, the other one was called Black Theatre Canada. And because they were black and because they were Caribbean-based, those were not considered Canadian stories, and therefore they fell off the funding stream and disappeared. So there's winners and losers. And that, to me, is what never gets discussed. So obviously, this whole panel came about because some guy didn't want to lose, right? Because they'd been winning for years. So now he thinks he's losing, so I'm going to write a blog post, and we're going to have this thing here. So I find that odd. I find it really, really difficult for a council to turn around and say, we're going to take one group of people and we're going to say that if you involve them in any of your art, you must deal with them in a certain way. And I kind of go, where is that support? Where is that care? Where is that sensitivity to things like black culture, which everybody can continue to rip off as long as they want? That's okay. Nobody gives a shit if you go and put black people in your play and treat them like white people. Nobody cares, right? Winners and losers. Language, words make up the language of our universe. So the words that we use are profound in shaping every conversation. So when diversity first started being used, it was race-based, right? It was black, Asian, whatever. And then diversity got bigger and bigger and bigger to include more and more, which it should, except the word diversity itself is skewing the discussion in a particular way. And that's why companies like Obsidian and Fujian call ourselves culturally specific. Obsidian is a black culturally specific theater, right? Tarragon is a white culturally specific theater. And that's not a pejorative, it's just a thing. You can tell by the work they do. But it's specific because we're not diverse from any universal mainstream. And we do not want to define ourselves in relation to a white majority. So language is important. So whenever you get a chance, please use culturally specific instead of culturally diverse. It's been a road. I mean, Obsidian was founded because we didn't see our stories on stage, and we do Canadian work, but it may not be as accepted. So there's a constant conversation about what is and who is Canadian. And I think that is another part of this big equation. I think this is a great question to start from. I think it's a very limited and small question because it opens up to a huge, huge dialogue about what it means to be a Canadian and be a Canadian artist and a Canadian playwright, and having that voice being as valued within the conversation and not as a sidebar, as a tangent, as out of the main room. The only other thing, I can't believe I'm going to quote Steve Bannon. I know, it's ridiculous, right? But even a broken clock is right twice a day. And he said, politics downstream from culture. Politics downstream from culture. You change the culture, you change the politics. So thank you, Steve, because it's brilliant. And I think it's something worth considering for all of us.
I am Kanyangahaga, Mohawk, of the Haudenosaunee. It's good to have my feet back on customary territory. It grounds me. But this is also a sharing space, as was mentioned. And thank you for that acknowledgement that this was shared territory, a place to gather, a place to come together, to share. And I want us to be here in that spirit. But we're talking about something that's near and dear to my heart. Being an artist, a curator, gallery director, writer. Now, I work on the dark side. So that's been a bit of an interesting journey for me. The Canada Council has been in an interesting journey for the last few years as well. There's been a lot of talk about what we call the transformation. Other people have other words for it. But it has indeed been a transformation. And I want to put that a little bit in context, and I'm happy to talk about that tonight. You're right, Philip, language is important. And I want to point out one thing before I start, because I'm going to be speaking mostly tonight about the relationship with the Indigenous peoples of this land. And I just want to say that we are not an equity-seeking group. We are a sovereignty-seeking group. We're the first peoples of this land. It gives us a different relationship. Of course, we welcome culturally specific peoples to share this land and share this place of gathering. But we are the sovereign peoples of this land. We need to reflect that in the way we think, in the way we act, and the way we fund. So I'll just remind us of where the Canada Council and many of the other cultural institutions of this nation state were born of. And that was the Massey Report in 1951. And the Massey Report was created to strategize ways to nurture, preserve, and promote Canadian culture. It was part of the myth building of nationhood of Canada. It was important at the time. Bring people together, create a bonding right after the Second World War, even more important. So that's what it set out to do, to help create the Canadian mythology. And one of the ways it did that was by creating the Canada Council for the Arts, or recommending that that happen. And lo, these 60 years, much of what we've done has been based on the Massey Report and its recommendations. But I'll just remind you of one thing that the Massey Report says that we don't know a lot about. They wrote, "Since the death of true Indian arts is inevitable, Indians should not be encouraged to prolong the existence of arts which at best must be artificial and at worst are degenerate. The impact of the white man with his more advanced civilization and his infinitely superior techniques resulted in the gradual destruction of the Indian way of life. The Indian arts thus survive only as ghosts or shadows of a dead society. They can never, it is said, regain real form or substance. Indian art as such cannot be revived." This is the founding document of the Canada Council for the Arts. And I would argue that for much of its existence, it's pretty much maintained that. And also used that same sentiment against others. Because what, for the longest time, and it's this word's been thrown out, phrase has been thrown out now a couple of times, artistic merit. It's an esoteric thing. Everybody seems to know what it is, and for a long time, it was a certain thing. It was a lens, a colonial lens, a Euro-Western lens, a white lens. And that's how funding decisions were made, because everybody understood what artistic merit was, what it looked like. It was based on certain disciplines, which were the only recognized ones. That's how the Canada Council worked for a long time. Disciplinary sections, music, theater, visual art, which means a very certain kind of thing. And funds went to professional artists, and we knew what those were, the ones who made money, because they're the ones who got on the stages of those white organizations. And there were those artists who got on the walls of those galleries. That started to change, not from inside, from outside. from pressure being put on by artists, by cultural producers, by people who wanted to make, create. And slowly change did happen, but it didn't happen fundamentally because we still based all those things. Even though Canada Council for the Arts has had Aboriginal specific programs for just over 20 years, they were still couched in colonial boxes run by people who still did things a certain way. And slowly change happens. People come into the system. Peer assessment committees become more diverse. The people who work there start to understand that there are art forms, that there are art histories that aren't well understood. They bring them in. But then you start to fundamentally think we need to make big shifts now. Canada Council for the Arts can't be just an ATM where people slip in their grant application and hope they still have money in their account. We have to take a responsibility to what we do, to the obligations that we have, to the responsibilities. Instead of nation building, we have to be society building. So that's the basis of the transformation. We've gone, instead of based on this, never really had a definition, but the wink, wink, nudge, nudge of artistic merit, to outcome driven. What is it that we want to achieve? And yes, relevance. And yes, artists making things that are excellent. And how do we decide that? Well, we bring in peers. We expand the way we think about what art is, what art can be. And we think about the society that we live in. And we try to reflect the values, the responsibility, the obligations of that society. I'm not going to go any farther than that because part of the impetus for this panel obviously was a reaction to a position that the Canada Council took on the misappropriation of Indigenous peoples and cultures. And again, taking that obligation to take these positions. So I thought if some of you may not be aware of the actual position that was co-authored by myself and the Canada Council CEO, Simon Brault. So I'll just take a couple minutes to read it if you don't mind,
Sure.
Keith.
Yep.
Jesse Wente writes, "Our stories have been stolen and silenced for years, while our bodies and land have been abused and broken. One allows the other," end quote. At a time when Canada is re-examining the place and scope of Indigenous peoples' inherent treaty and constitutional rights, the Canada Council for the Arts considers it relevant and timely to take positions on cultural appropriation and the rights of Indigenous peoples to the protection of their cultures. In doing so, the Canada Council is consistent with the approach of reconciliation and decolonization that is at the heart of its strategic plan. The Canada Council must take into account the historical challenge that Canada is now facing after the publication of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report in June 2015 explicitly demonstrated the attempted cultural genocide against Indigenous peoples of this land. As CEO Simon Brault reminds us, as a public arts funder, we are aware, in a way we were not 60 years ago, of the deliberate attempts throughout Canada's history to eradicate the cultures and languages of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We have an obligation and a responsibility to transform ourselves to better support Indigenous artists and communities on their own terms, end quote. As Canada's public arts funder, the Canada Council bases its activities, philosophy, and raison d'etre on core values and explicit strategic commitments. Thus, it wholeheartedly supports freedom of artistic expression by protecting it from external dominance. Furthermore, the Canada Council is formally committed to respect the histories, traditions, languages, and contemporary practices of Indigenous peoples. As Anishinaabe artist Aileen Kuchi has so powerfully articulated, quote, "The appropriation of Indigenous stories, ways of being, and artworks is simply an extension of colonialism and settlers' assertion of rights over the property of Indigenous people. The history of colonizing Indigenous identity through images, film, and narrative has played its part in placing Indigenous perspectives at a subordinate level. It's this hegemonic system filled with stereotypes and suppression that continues to thrive within institutions. It erects barriers for Indigenous voices," end quote. We are all agents of either stasis or change. For every act of political, social, or cultural agency that challenges the status quo, there will always be opposing forces fueled by colonial entrenchment, privilege, oppositional paranoia, or simply inertia. The Canada Council is committed to reaffirming and revitalizing its relationship with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada. The Council believes that an approach that respects First Nations, Inuit, and Métis artistic expression, cultural protocols, Indigenous rights, and Indigenous worldviews is a fundamental part of the process of conciliation and reconciliation in this country. We understand this to mean that the customary and contemporary cultural and artistic practices of Indigenous peoples must remain in the control of Indigenous peoples and communities. In this context, the Canada Council affirms and supports the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, specifically Articles 11 and 31. Article 11 reads, Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as archaeological and historical sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, and visual and performing arts and literature. And Article 31, which reads, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, literatures, designs, sports and traditional games, and visual and performing arts. They also have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. By affirming the UNDRIP Declaration, the Canada Council commits to a nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples that is rights-based and comprehensive. By supporting and embedding the UNDRIP within our value system, we make clear a path forward to self-determination and cultural sovereignty for Indigenous peoples without compromising our support for artistic and creative expression. The Canada Council has and will always maintain its support of free expression and artistic independence for cultural creators and producers. But these freedoms are only actualized when they come with responsibility, reciprocity, and respect. In this case, respect for the authority of Indigenous voices in the telling of their stories and an understanding of the role cultural appropriation has played in the oppression and violence against Indigenous peoples. We must always be cognizant of the power dynamics that give rise to cultural appropriation and the politics of race and colonial privilege in Canada, and that continue to exist. Indigenous peoples have been marginalized, stereotyped, and maligned for centuries. Real reconciliation and decolonization must include acknowledgements and redress of this historic and current reality. As Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard points out, quote, authentic decolonization must directly confront more than mere economic relations. It has to account for the multifarious ways in which capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, and the totalizing character of state power interact with one another to form the constellation of power relations that sustain colonial patterns of behavior, structures, and relationships, end quote. The Canada Council for the Arts will continue to encourage and support the creative freedom of all artists, but we insist that it is done respectfully and truly honors the fundamental and inalienable right of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples to cultural sovereignty. The Canada Council also considers it suitable to ask the artists and organizations applying for grants for projects that address, deal with, incorporate, comment on, interpret, or depict unique aspects of the First Nations, Inuit, or Métis culture to show that they have respect and true regard for Indigenous art and culture in their endeavors. Without dictating a specific or mandatory way to go about it, it can be expected that authentic and respectful efforts have been made to engage with artists or other members of the Indigenous communities whose culture or protocols are addressed by the project for which the Canada Council's support is sought. Thank you.
All right, so maybe we'll, I think it's a good question to actually to ask because the relationship the Canadian government has with Indigenous nations and the relationship they have with Black people and people of color is not the same. And oftentimes in the past, there's a lot of historical evidence in terms of funding where it becomes us versus them. So maybe that's a question, is that how, with with the doubling of the Canada Council budget and with more money being put on the table for artists and organizations, how can we, because we are all allies, I'll say like one of the great, when I first became artistic director at Native Earth, the first person who called me was Philip Bacon, and he took me out for lunch and just talked to me about being a new artistic director. And I was the only artistic director to do that, and I was so humbled because I'd always looked up to him as a director and as artistic director. And to me, it was, in that moment, we shared space together and talked. And to me, it's like, how do we do more of that? Because as someone who runs an Indigenous organization, there is the perception out there that money is being given to Indigenous artists and organizations and not being given to other people in a certain way that can at times be negative, and it ends up being this us versus them thing. And I would love to ask the panel to discuss maybe how do we overcome that?
I can only speak from my personal perspective, which is that if I think about the priority of my values, that yes, of course, I want to be able to make my things and share my things with the world and share my things with many, many people. And we're not, while we live in a place of abundance, but we don't have so much abundance that everybody's going to get what they want. And so the priority of values has to come into play. And to me, participating in reconciliation is pretty high on my priority of values right now. And so that for me is an attitude adjustment to say, okay, I don't get it this round. I think artists are pretty used to disappointment and rejection, and we'll get over it. And I feel like we're in uncharted territory. We don't know how to do this thing. And so it's going to be uncomfortable, and it's going to be, there's going to be hurt feelings, there's going to be rage, there's going to be anger, there's going to be loss. But I think we can all agree that it's the right thing to do.
The entire entertainment business is made up of people who firmly believe they do not get their just deserves. Right? Right?
Yep.
Nobody is getting what they think they deserve to get. And that's a sad, sad fact for a business. But it's true. You know, I can't tell you how many, and I meet with people on a regular basis. We have an open door policy at Obsidian, so people can just walk in, and you walk in the front door, you're in my office. And we talk, and I take people out for lunch. And it's, you know, I spend a good chunk of money every year talking with young artists, right? And you try to be realistic and not crush them at the same time. But you become aware that you know, it's everybody believes they should be getting something somehow, and that they deserve it more than the other person. And that's sad, but it's true. And then a lot of people get crushed and they leave. You know, it's a hard business in many ways. The creation of art is hard. None of this should be easy. You don't sharpen your artistic ideas and artistic values using cotton batten. You sharpen ideas using granite and steel. And art has to be made that way. And so I think the difficult questions are the ones that profit us most. And you cannot solve all of the issues. While I listen and I understand and I respect, you know, what the Canada Council saying, you know, I kind of go, frankly, okay, that's great. Doesn't really apply to me. Doesn't apply to black people. Great. But, you know, we have segmented ourselves in a certain way because one can't fight everybody's battles, right? There's a thing right now that I've been reading about because Unapologetically Black, which is a place I like to live at, right? And it's to bring black culture wherever I am, even if I'm the only black person in the room, which is very hinky when I'm down at the Shaw Festival directing Shaw, right? But I certainly can't. I mean, maybe people who are younger and have more years of life left in them, they can do it, but I can't. And so I focus on the market and the niche that I believe in, that I can affect, I can make change, and that is with Black artists. So, yeah, there's part of me that kind of goes, yep, I'm all for everybody else's struggles and fights. And on the same hand, I kind of go, I gotta say, I mean, there's a part of me that aches when I hear what you said, and I hear Chief Perry Bellegarde saying, you know, that Indigenous peoples are sovereign peoples, and you kind of realize, yeah, this country still is now First Nations, Francophone white, Anglophone white, and all the rest of us are somehow ethnic minorities, is the word he used. So you kind of feel, you know, this isn't really, we're not part of this discussion. And I can't change that, but I can keep making the art that I make. So it gets to be a very tricky and tender area, because for people like myself, the where are you from, do you belong here question is the ultimate question to always deny your right to exist. And that's what we get told over and over and over again. And so I hear echoes of that many times. And at the same time, I go, yo, that's great. That's absolutely right. Those people deserve what they deserve. But it becomes a very complex argument, and I don't think it's simple.
I'm going to be really bureaucratic and and say only that it's not exactly a zero-sum game that the funders deal with, but it can be very close to a zero-sum game. It's actually why I'm so excited about what the Canada Council has the opportunity to do and is beginning to do, to completely remake an institution, because the budget is being doubled. So they're not going to like take money away from half the folks that are funded now. They're actually able to build it. It's going to be extremely exciting. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Because at the margins, it operates like a zero-sum game, and it shouldn't, but it does.
Disentangling yourself from the colonial is a very complex task for all of us who are caught up in it and who want to do that work. And at what point we must disentangle ourselves, our nations, however we see ourselves, in the way that speaks to who you are. And that's where some of this comes from, because as Indigenous people, we are disentangling from colonialism in a certain way, in the sovereign way. That does not take away from the struggles of anybody else, nor does it take anything away from anybody else. As Pat mentioned, we are in a position of luxury at the Canada Council right now, going from a $180 million budget to a $360 million budget. And I could point out the stats even in the first year about how much more funding went to various groups, various distinct communities, which it has because of the new funding model and because of the a new way of doing equity-based funding at the Canada Council, which I think has paid off. It needs to be better, absolutely. There's no doubt those voices and that strength must be put to bear on the Canada Council. It's why we struggled so long to be able to create a program that is specifically Indigenous, and it's apart from the other programs. It's fundamentally different. It has different. It has a different base to it. It has different values to it. It has a different worldview. It has different applicant base. It has different kinds of activities that we fund specific to us because we had to do it that way. We had to. We had to assert that. Because we have a different art history. We have different art histories from our nations. We have different artistic traditions, customary as well as contemporary practices, many based on resistance, others based on ceremony. We had to understand that. We had to embody that in creating knowing and sharing. It's why it's different than all the other 5 major programs. It had to be. It was the only way. And I hope that we can disentangle further. But it's not, Pam Palmater said, it's not true reconciliation if it's not uncomfortable. So I think we have a lot of conciliation to do on this land, not just with Indigenous people. And it's going to get uncomfortable, and it needs to be uncomfortable.
Philip, you talked, I'm going to quote Steve Bannon again, about change the culture and then you change the politics. And I've seen the results at the Canada Council, and there's been a big push for historical inequities, and companies and theater companies, dance, across the board have received more funding and stronger support. And so being reflected back to yourself on stage, if that culture changes, do you see the positive change to that? Do you see, like, feeling on the outside, and when those changes are going through, do you see that as a positive change, and do you see that changing?
I don't know if there's an outside anymore, because I don't know if there's an inside anymore.
Right.
Right? I mean, it's like putting a mirror back together. You know, there's a lot of shards of glass there, right? All silvered at the back, and so I would, first of all, I'd just like to say Obsidian received 145% increase on our funding from the Canada Council, and that's great. I don't take it as a gimme, right? Nobody was being nice to the black people. We earned every dollar for what, and we worked hard to show strong artistic, strong fiscal management, and did everything that we said we could. We made every dime worth 30 cents. So we earned it, is my feeling. I hope that's the way it felt at the council level. So Keith, it's just there's everything is fracturing in a way that gets smaller and smaller. And I mean, I used to make a joke, which probably isn't correct anymore. It was like LGBT alphabet soup. You know, it was just like this huge long thing. But that to me was the best way to encompass the idea of so many different groups of people now standing up and forming together for their rights and fighting for what they believe in. So I don't know. I don't necessarily feel on the outside of artistic practice, but I just think that we do what we do, and we work for our niche primarily.
What I would say to that is, yes, we did see it that way inside the council, and part of those funding decisions were not, gifts to the black folk. Mm-hmm. It was about acknowledging that and being able to, with some money finally, to be able to recognize that. And I mean, one of my program officers came up to me afterward because we were able to give substantial increases to our operating organizations. And she said it was the best day in her professional life because she's been on the other side and, working in organizations where you score high or do whatever and get nothing for it because there was no money there. And I think part of the transformation has been recognizing that and being able to, it's a couple more years that's going to be it. We're not going to get another doubling of our funding anytime soon. But at least we're able to acknowledge some of the historic gaps, whether those were inequities or things that just weren't funded because there was no money and people were doing it anyway. And I think anytime we get to do that as a community, we need to celebrate not the Canada Council, but just the fact that we're all still doing it.
Because a lot of the jury process at a funding body comes through peer assessment. So all our peers from across the country, or across the province, or across the city look at all the applications and they assess their artistic merit. It's subjective. But we always come up with the dilemma of entertainment versus socially relevant. And we've all been in a room where we're looking at an application that is, we know that public will love it, that it's great, but people around the table don't necessarily consider it high art or good art. They just know that lots of people will come to it. And then it's judged against judged. It's the merits are put up against something like you had spoken
But
before.
it's like it's a bad thing.
It's like a bad-
If everybody's gonna like it, then it's bad. And then if you're doing like the medicine art, like the art, like you just want a spoonful of sugar to get that art down, then like that's the good art. And that's it's hard.
It is.
Right? Because we are entertainers too. We are. Some of us are entertainers. Some of us are entertainers. Some of us transcend. Some of us try to transcend every day to create transcendent spaces within a performance room. I think that there really has to be room for all of those things. Like there really, really has to be room. There has to be room for people to make bad art too, because that is the only way to learn how to make better art and maybe then eventually good art. Is all the bad art going to get funded by Canada Council? Some of it has.
They funded me.
Yeah, but that has to be fine. Like it has to be kind of like it has to be the gift that gets that you have to disengage the hook of artistic merit in a way once that application has passed the table. Because when you're a maker, if you're trying to make and you have this shadowy looming artistic merit hanging over you, chances are you're not going to hit it. Like nobody's going out trying to make shitty art. Everybody's trying to make excellent art. And sometimes you actually hit the mark and sometimes you don't. But if you fail, that shouldn't mean that you can't come back and try again. But what I really appreciate about the granting process as an artist is the way that it forces me to crystallize my thoughts, to articulate where I'm at as an artist, to say, you know what, I made that shitty piece of art back then, but these are the things that I learned, and this is what I'm building off of, and this is where I'm going now, and this is my next vision, and this one is going to be excellent. Yeah.
I just wanted to also just say to Pat, just because you said there's good and there's bad bureaucratic, systems, and that system of entertainment versus socially relevant, is that bureaucratic system, is that one of the gooder? I didn't say that. One of the better? We've been in juries together, and that is a concept. Like, how do you navigate that? Like, is that one of those bureaucratic systems that's challenging?
I'm actually trying to think of things. I just finished a theatre projects jury last week. So I spent 3 days with 5 theatre professionals from around the province, and we looked at 161 applications. And I don't remember having that particular discussion, which is not to say that there were things there that were more potentially commercial and things that were less commercial. And I think the kind of good bureaucratic tortured process we go through weighs those things in different ways, and we've certainly funded things that have had commercial potential at that table. In fact, I think you were at the table once when we did a couple of things that ended up being very commercially successful, and you didn't need honey to take them. The medicine. So it's too binary, that question for me.
Right.
I mean, I totally hear what Adrian's saying, and in fact, I would go further to say that a lot of that art that's participatory and relevant and purposeful is the kind of art that at the table you have to ask yourself the question about, are the people who need to be in the group making the art there? Are the people who understand that story? Are the people who lived that story, whether they're street-involved youth or any other group, are they actually being treated respectfully in that process? Sorry, I went off on a completely different tangent, sorry.
If anyone has any questions about things we've talked about, also just things that you have on your mind.
I just wanted to know, I'm in PhD, I just graduated today.
Hey!
I'm with the social work department. I wanted to know, when you were speaking about Indigenous and Aboriginal individuals, I felt as a First Nation status that we missed a whole bunch of other people. There's, I don't know if the subject was either spoken for a certain individual, but there's Ojibwe and Ojibwe, and there's American, Native Americans. Like, we always include everybody in the circle. So I felt that people were being discluded. Sorry. I'm just outspoken, and I felt that we're missing out other people because First Nation is a circle of life, right? So I wanted to know if, for the subject, why we're only Métis and what was it?
Inuit.
Métis and
Within the context of Turtle Island, because Canada Council, we fund, so we use those terms because those are the three Indigenous groups of Turtle Island. First Nations encompassing all of the nations, whether it's Cree, Ojibwe, Kanien'kehá:ka, Inuit, which are specific peoples, and the Métis, which is a modern Indigenous. But those encompass all the ones from this land. But of course, within our circle, we include nations from outside Turtle Island, but we can't fund them. So we use the term, it was important when we created the program to name our people, so creating Noy and sharing the arts and cultures of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, because they're the ones we serve directly.
I can appreciate that. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for this great panel. I have a question about the word urgency, that there's been a feeling in the communities that I operate in, but also listening to funders, there's a certain urgency to respond to long-standing systemic barriers, both around income precarity, cultural and specificity and inclusion and diversity, but also doing things differently and expanding the kinds of dialogues that we have with funders and asking how we report the impacts that we're having, the insights, the learning, the experiences that we're having differently to funders so that we can just basically grow as a community and fund better and experience and share art better. I'm wondering if any members of the panel have thoughts on this word about urgency and how we decide as a nation to transform our funding bodies with urgency, but also in an effective way, to take a bit more time perhaps to roll things out and allow people to be involved and make sure that the things are, once they're rolled out, are inclusive and operating clean and efficiency. So there's an urgency to transform, but artistic practices often take years to mature and complete a project. There's urgency, but with time. And I'm wondering if there's something that the funders can learn from artists about sense of urgency and how it's implemented.
You know Othello, the play, Bill Shakespeare, you might have heard of him. He's got a thing there where there's double time, right? Because in one reading of it, it takes Othello a few weeks to get to Cyprus, and it takes Desdemona months. And so in the same flip, and I think there's, when you talk about that kind of urgency, you're talking about different time streams, different time flows. You know, there's today in Toronto, and then there's glacial time, right? And I think you have to encompass all of that. Because whereas I may have a program that is devised to help young Black directors learn crafts quickly so they can get and move up the ladder quickly, that takes a certain length of time. So I think it becomes unique to every institution, every project, every initiative. What is the actual time frame we're talking about? Because some of it takes years, right? It just does. And I think that has to be just understood with it. There are both pitfalls in the quick movement and the slow movement, right?
And the sense of urgency, and I hear you, and we've heard it internally as well. The whole thing took 4 years. So for us, that was a lot of time, but you know what? It wasn't enough time. And I think our CEO has, said we should have taken a little bit more time with this. That is absolutely true. We have urgencies that are bureaucratic in nature, unfortunately, as well, where we have to show results of these kinds of changes. And also, because we got this doubling of our funding, the urgency on us to show its effectiveness, that's an absolute one that we have to do, or else they can take it back. So it's the competing of that. And I think in that, we've missed some things. We're now having to, the transformation itself, I think, is very positive from my, overall. But are there areas that weren't as well thought out, or did we miss some things? Absolutely, because of that. So I agree with you. The important part for us now is because we have the frame for it, I think it's now just a matter of improving it. And for that, we're going to have to do a lot more communicating with our communities. Our director of arts granting and the CEO were just out in Alberta doing town halls, and we're going to do some more of those and connect more with the community. The directors of the programs are going to be doing a lot of that. So there was urgency. Now let's kind of improve as we move forward, because I think that's vital. We can't be dogmatic about it.
Those different times in one way are political time and art time. And political time has very different things. And the politicians that increase the money to the Canada Council, certainly the politicians that increase the money to us, I'm looking at my colleagues from the Toronto Arts Council there, the politicians want answers the next day about what their money did and how y'all got out to more audiences and whatever. And that's trying to hold them off while introducing enough change to make an impact in the community. So there's that piece, and then there's the outcomes measurement piece, which I don't think any of us as funders are really great at it yet, but it has to go into how we go forward.
That just makes me think, Steve, of how the programs were all revised and changed before there was any hint that there was going to be more money.
Oh, that had started.
Yeah.
already,
So in a sense, like that restructuring was to deal with to me from the outside, to deal with like the lack of funds, like to try and find a way to better serve the artists with the paucity, like the lack of resource, and then to suddenly, so it's kind of designed for poverty. And then suddenly, like somebody, like there was a flood, right? And we're like, oh no, like is this gonna hold?
Yeah. Some of it was just because what had happened is, so most of you know, we would have programs for support. So within our disciplinary sections, and then we added offices because we had to address things that hadn't been funded before. Then within the sections, every time a new genre, art form, or whatever hybrid practice, we would create a new little program. So we end up with 147 funding mechanisms. And that's just unsustainable after ours. And again, it does speak to efficiency, because if we're putting a jury together for every one of these little boxes, that's taking money out of the community. So yes, there was no hint. We were still under the Harper regime at the time. There was no hint we were getting any more money, and the fear that we might lose some. So yeah, absolutely.
It's on? Yeah, okay. I wonder if I could just change the topic a little bit. First of all, thank you very much for your thoughtful words, and I'm very moved by the stories and the impact it's having on the Canadian society. I'm not particularly impressed with the impact it's having on artists and the development of art. However, I was moved by a couple of statements. One, Adrienne made when she, at the beginning, talked about the art is often made for some reason that's been thought up. She used the word relevance, and I would use the word relevance as it's a very bad idea. Whenever something is relevant, I like to run away because it's anti-art. Art that's taken up by bureaucrats to do something is something else. And then there was a point that Philip Aiken made when he said he certainly would notice that the arts funding has changed the entire ecosystem. Those are very profound points which speak to what happens in art itself, in the sense of it being a cultural or actually a civilizational thing. And What I'm hearing is two sides here. And I don't think I'm hearing the major thing addressed. I'm hearing in the artists' discussions, and a couple of people representing that, but of course it goes way beyond, as you would appreciate, there is something that goes on that's called art. And it's not been discussed here today. And then from the arts funders' point of view, you speak of, frankly, forming society, shaping society, working society. You're social constructivists. And that's great. You have a purpose in our society. That's wonderful. But to say that we must respect people to be artists, well, okay, I respect the fact that in order to get funds from the arts organization set up by the government, yes, you have to show that. Totally fair. But to claim somehow that this is connected to the creation of art is hubris and not connected to the development of art. It will never be discussed in the history of art as being something which has been helpful. And maybe you can help some niche group, but I doubt it. I very much do. So I think that the discussions going on today are polite and frankly a little irrelevant. Thank you. Why are you here anyway? You're not really talking about art, and you're not really talking about this subject. I just think you've missed the point. Why are you here? Why are you bothering?
Well, I would suggest, and this is the only point I'll make, is that we're not talking about your art, and that's your problem. No, we're not talking about the kind of art that you're thinking about, and I think you're not listening that there's a bigger discussion going on all over that is much past that very disjointed and outmoded view. So that's all I'll say.
I'm kind of speechless, but only because I don't. These are all artists and people that I look up to as an artist. I've been working for almost 20 years, and I respect the work that has come out of the work of these people. These are all artists and have, like me, lived through poverty and done the art that you're talking about. But the work that and the call to work for the Canada Council or the Ontario Arts Council to be an artistic director at a theatre company, to be an independent artist working, there is you need to respect that. And people up here are up here because they want to discuss and talk about how art funding impacts, but also also questioning, does it impact? And I think that's always great. I think it is a hard conversation to have, but it's also, I think everyone up here is being respectful, and I think we had some actual pretty thorny things we had to talk about, and we don't have a lot of time, but we had enough time that we could start to address them and then continue the conversation. This isn't the start and the end of it. So I respectfully disagree, but thank you for your question.
Hi, so I'm in the School of Performance. I'm in the acting program. I'm in a very Eurocentric, white, heavy population. Like, the demographic is very white. And what that has done for us and the people of color, which you can all count on your 10 fingers in the program, is made us very hyper-aware of the attitudes, the narratives, and also the discrepancies therein. And one of those things that we've been hyper-aware of is the fact that there's kind of been this gravitation towards casting people of color, towards telling stories of people of color, and that's what gets you work. And I've been told before that one of the reasons I'm going to work is because I'm Arab, is because I'm new generation, is because my parents don't speak English. And it's interesting that you ask, why are they here? And I'm going to answer that to you. Because it is the bastion of privilege and white supremacy to think that art has no impact. It is a very privileged notion to think that the art that we create does not impact, does not change the political discourse. And for you, but for us, art is everything. For the people of color, for minorities, for the people who are underprivileged, all we have is art to tell those politics. Because a lot of us can't access those social constructive, whatever you said. Anyways, the point I'm saying is, what I'm wondering now is, because I don't know much about it. I haven't been in the industry. I'm a student. I'm asking, is this gravitation towards telling these stories of people of color? Because white people are still running the show. White people are still, I'm seeing CEOs. I'm not seeing black women as CEOs. I'm not seeing black women. I'm not seeing queer people of color. I'm not seeing those people that are, we want to tell those stories. I'm not seeing them run the show. I'm not seeing dollars in their communities. What I'm wondering is, from your perspectives, people who've been in this industry for a long time, is this a genuine gravitation? Is this a genuine attempt at including people of color in these discussions? Or is it just another marketing tactic, a marketing scheme that gets people talking, that gets people seeing shows? Because I'm seeing it at Stratford, I'm seeing it at Shaw, I'm seeing it all over. Hamilton, all of that. So I wonder now, in this coming future, is this going to be how it is? Are we still going to have this, constant push for stories about people of color, but, not really a genuine intention?
I got such a rant. Come and have coffee with me, man. Because, but I will say this. There's a strategy that's been in play for a number of years. I call it raisin in the oatmeal. You sprinkle a few brown people in your show, and all of a sudden you get big credit, right? But you're not telling a black story or an Asian story. So this idea that you keep using the word stories, that doesn't happen, right? I have personally directed more black stories at Shaw than Stratford has ever produced in its history. Me personally, right? So there's a profound difference. I always say you don't brown the stage, you brown the company. You actually have to change the entire company. You don't end up with these kind of continual conversations and thinking that you put black, brown, Asian, any black people up on a deck and have them all act white. There are black actors at Stratford who've never played a black person, right? And they all get lots of kudos for that, right? I don't give the kudos for that. I think you have to tell black stories, you have to tell Arab stories, you have to tell Asian stories. It's the stories that are important. And that is the big systemic change that I think, frankly, Fujian and Obsidian and Cahoots and what Nina Lee Aquino is doing at Factory Theatre and any number of other culturally specific companies throughout the country, that's what they're trying to do, is develop those stories. And that's different than just getting a job for 8 months at a festival.
I think that there's an increased sensitivity around the table, say, for instance, at a jury. There's an increased sensitivity around authenticity of voice. Mm-hmm. So, I've seen things come through where the raisin in the oatmeal, which is lovely, a lovely analogy. But, nobody's a dummy up there. Like, you can sniff that out. You smell it. You're like, this is like tokenism. So there's increased sensitivity around that. And my position has always been, I don't want to go to Shaw or Stratford or change the color of the company. I want to make my own stuff. And then that authentic voice of my voice is what I'm working on. And then you find your people, right? And when you find your people, don't ever let them go, because those people, you grow together and you become unstoppable because you know each other and you get inside each other's heads. And so anyhow, now I've turned into pep talk, but I'll stop there.
I would also just say, I spent 1.5 years working at the Canada Council as a program officer. And I had the good fortune of working under Stephen. And when the new funding model came up, a lot of the Indigenous companies and organizations did not believe it was real. And we had to have a meeting and bring them in and really talk to them about what it was about. And it was written by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. And it was an authentic conversation, hard conversation, and it was all Indigenous people in the room of all different shapes, sizes, colors, everything, from all different parts of the country, having a real conversation about what this new program was and what it really meant, what a game changer it was. But it was, what the beautiful part of it was they were actually really talking about, like, this isn't the icing on top of a cake of something different. This is the cake, you know. And that was a really exciting, because I sat in the room and just took notes, and I watched everyone come in with kind of like okay, what is this? And then slowly it melted, and then slowly everyone was talking. And when they left, they were all genuinely excited about the possibility of change. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your question, because it sets the question that I was going to ask as well. Because one thing I'm wondering is, and I don't know if it's something that was discussed maybe by you, Keith, before I got here, about the whole like ticking the box, and organizations or people that are able to talk the talk but not actually walking. Anyways, you know that expression. Mm-hmm. And how much, does programming equal like change of values and organizational change? And to that end, is there a level of accountability for organizations done by arts councils, or how is that like a step or something that is talked about, and how to not leave that question to the communities and like doing the community justice piece of the things, but like, is there a level of accountability? Like, even if arts councils are getting more sensitized and knowing, what's real and what's not?
Yeah. I could throw it over to Stephen or Pat.
I'd say yes, absolutely. I think the expectations have risen, and I think that's clearly in line with values and societal norms right now. We've had to deal with things like sexual harassment and abuse, in the workplace. I mean, everybody knows about the Salt Pepper incident, and we can't say anymore, well, we're not the art police, we're not, it was a jury decision and we can't do anything. Well, there are some things we can do, and I think we have to put that on ourselves as funders, as being the distributors of public funds, that we have to take positions, that we have to hold our communities accountable as well, and hold ourselves accountable. We can't pretend things aren't out there that they are, and that's just one aspect of it. I mean, these others, that's part of it too. But I think, we, as agencies, we need to challenge ourselves to really be a part of, current discourses, but also to be part of solution making, and to be part of creating a better, at least arts ecosystem.
And I would agree. Yes, there is accountability. There is loss of funds by operating our core funded organizations that don't engage authentically with the appropriate folks in their community. And Stephen will know this as well. And actually, everybody around here has worked in a lot of communities. Toronto is actually not the center of the universe. So if you're operating a symphony or a theater company in Peterborough, it's very different than being in Toronto. And if you're in Thunder Bay, it's different again. But as appropriate for the community, absolutely. However, we are gradualists. Bureaucrats and bureaucracies tend to be gradualists. So it's like 1 year, and then the next year, and then the next year. And if genuine, authentic engagement doesn't happen over a number of years, there will be a big change.
I will also just say that when I worked at the council, we were rolling out the new funding model, and one of the major questions in the new applications was, how are you reflecting your community back to you? So Halifax is going to be different than Toronto, is going to be different than Thunder Bay. But one of the questions was, who's on your board? Like, how are you reflecting your community in your organization and on your boards and that? So it's not just like actors on the stage, like Philip's talking about. It's like, fundamentally, how are you changing the organization? And a lot of organizations panic. We're like, we don't have that. We don't. And it's like, okay, it's okay. But if you don't have that right now, what are your plans for the future? So that you are ready to take somebody on? Who's going to succeed you? Who's next in line that you're looking to either mentor or to help along so that you can diversify your organization? So that was a big part.
And if they don't, and they get dropped off funding, it's okay. It's okay for organizations to die
Yep.
if they can't change. That's okay.
And now it's part of the assessment.
Yeah.
It never used to be part of the assessment. We'd be like, well, we like them a little better, but now it's an actual part. They get scored on it.
And we've been scoring on it for a while, and you can see, as I said, gradual movement. It's not immediate movement.
Yeah.
Especially from the Canada Council, I guess this would apply to mostly, but perhaps the Ontario Arts Council, I'm not sure. There used to be a number of mechanisms to promote artists on the international stage, and then they were disappeared, a lot of them, with the Harper government, I believe. I just wondered with this new transformation if any of you could speak to the mechanisms or supports to promote Canadian art internationally, I guess.
Yeah, there were 2 programs that were out of Canadian heritage that were eliminated. We have recommitted to international because we see that absolutely as part of our strategic plan. It's one of our 4 fundamental commitments. Is to international. So we've created one of the big new programs is called Arts Abroad, and it's just about international. So it has several components. We're also engaged in much more working closely with Global Affairs Canada and the Department of Canadian Heritage so that we can work together. We're working through our missions there and our consulates and our embassies there to help and use their resources as well to get our artists internationally. So we've committed a substantial amount of money to it, which I think will really help that. And we're hoping that Heritage actually brings back or creates new programs as well. There is some talk about that.
And a dozen years ago, when we got another bit of new money, we introduced an international touring program, and all of our touring programs have been beneficiary of new money with our new money because we acknowledge the importance of moving Canadian artists around the country and around the world.
All right, well, we'd like to thank the Centre for Free Expression for having us this evening, to Jim and Ange for hosting us. Thank you to our panelists here, Adrian, Stephen, Pat, and Philip, and to the crew here who did a fantastic job, Miigwech, and also just thank you to the audience for coming, for your questions, and thank you.
Thanks, Keith.